The woman's scream cut through the desert wind like a knife through butter, and Yates Brennan dropped the elk carcass he had been hauling toward his camp to scan the canyon below for the source of that terrified cry. His muscles tensed beneath his buckskin shirt as he spotted her, a figure in a pale blue traveling dress standing at the edge of the Rio Grande, her carpetbag clutched in white-knuckled hands as she stared at the churning brown water that separated her from the eastern bank. Even from this distance, Yates could see the problem immediately. The spring snowmelt from the mountains had turned what was usually a manageable crossing into a violent torrent that would sweep away anyone foolish enough to attempt it alone. He watched as she took a tentative step toward the water, then retreated as a wave crashed against the rocks near her feet. Yates had been traveling south toward Hachita, New Mexico for 3 weeks now, his horse laden with the winter's worth of pelts he had trapped in the high country. It was May of 1876, and he had not seen another human being since leaving his cabin in the San Juan Mountains of southern Colorado. At 32 years old, he had grown accustomed to solitude, preferring the company of the wilderness to the noise and complications of civilization. But something about that woman's desperate situation pulled at something deep in his chest, some instinct he thought he had left behind when he abandoned his former life 5 years ago. He moved down the rocky slope with the sure-footedness of a man who had spent years navigating treacherous terrain, his long dark hair tied back with a leather cord, his broad shoulders carrying his supplies with ease, the muscles in his thighs flexed as he descended, his keen gray eyes never leaving the woman who now paced along the riverbank like a caged animal. When he was close enough to be heard over the roar of the water, he called out, his voice deep and carrying, "Madam, you planning on swimming that river or just studying it?" She whirled around, her hand flying to her chest, and Yates got his first clear look at her face. She was perhaps 24 or 25, with auburn hair that had come loose from its pins to frame a face that was equal parts beautiful and exhausted. Her green eyes were red-rimmed, whether from crying or the dust that swirled constantly through this canyon, he could not tell. Mud caked the hem of her dress, and a tear in the sleeve suggested she had already encountered some trouble on her journey. "I need to cross," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "My stagecoach left me behind in Espanola when I fell ill. They said they could not wait. I have been walking for 2 days, following the river south, and I must reach Hachita before the end of the week. My sister is there. She is expecting me, and she does not know I am delayed. She will worry." Yates studied the river, then turned his gaze back to the woman. "That water will kill you before you make it halfway across. Current is running at least 8 miles an hour, maybe more. You would not have a chance." Her face crumpled slightly, and he saw her jaw tremble before she said it with determination. "Then I will walk until I find a safer place to cross. Nearest safe ford is 40 miles south, and that is if the water has gone down by the time you reach it. Could take you a week on foot." Yates scratched his jaw, feeling the thick beard that had grown wild over the winter months. He knew what he had to do, even if every instinct told him to avoid entanglements with strangers. "I can get you across, have rope and experience with swift water, but it will not be pleasant." Hope flared in those green eyes, and she took a step toward him. "You would do that? For a stranger?" "Cannot leave you to drown or die of exposure out here," he said gruffly, already shrugging off his pack. "Name is Yates Brennan. I trap in the high country and trade Hachita twice a year. Was headed that direction anyway." "Eleanor Ortiz," she said, and he caught the slight accent that suggested Spanish heritage mixed with something else, perhaps Irish given that auburn hair. "I am grateful beyond words, Mr. Brennan. I have some money. I can pay you for your trouble." He waved off the offer as he began pulling rope from his pack. "Keep your money. This is just being decent." He had brought nearly 100 feet of strong hemp rope, essential equipment for any mountain man. He had used it to haul game, to cross rivers, to rappel down cliff faces when tracking prey. Now it would serve another purpose. Yates moved along the bank until he found what he was looking for, a massive cottonwood tree whose roots dug deep into the earth. He tested it with his weight, pulling hard, and when it held firm, he tied one end of the rope around the trunk with a series of complex knots that would not slip under strain. Then he tied the other end around his own waist, leaving about 60 feet of rope between himself and the tree. Eleanor watched with wide eyes as he secured a second shorter rope around his waist. "What is that for?" she asked. "This goes around you," he said, meeting her eyes. "I am going to cross first, test the current and find the best path. Then I am going to come back for you. When we cross together, you will be tied to me. If the water takes you, I will still have hold of you. Understand?" She nodded, her throat working as she swallowed. "I understand. Can you swim at all?" he asked. "A little. I learned as a child in a pond, but nothing like this. Forget everything you know, Yates said. In water like this, swimming will just tire you out. You are going to hold on to me, and I am going to get us both across. You have to trust me completely. If you panic and fight me, we both could die. I will not panic, Eleanor said, and there was steel in her voice that made him believe her. Yates studied the river one more time, reading the currents the way another man might read a book. He could see where the water ran fastest, where hidden rocks created dangerous eddies, where the depth dropped suddenly. He plotted his path mentally, then waded into the shallows. The cold water hit him like a physical blow, snowmelt that could not have been more than a few degrees above freezing. He heard Eleanor gasp behind him as she saw him stagger slightly from the shock of it. But Yates had endured worse. He had spent winters in the high country where the temperature dropped so low that spit froze before it hit the ground. He had fallen through ice into freezing streams and hauled himself out through sheer will and strength. This water was brutal, but he had faced brutal before. He pushed forward, feeling the current try to sweep his legs out from under him. His powerful thighs held firm, his boots finding purchase on the rocky riverbed. The water rose to his knees, then his waist, then his chest. He felt the rope around his middle go taut as the current pushed him downstream, but the cottonwood held. He angled his body, using his size and strength to fight the water, and made steady progress toward the far bank. When he finally pulled himself out on the other side, his breath was coming hard and his muscles burned from the effort. He took a moment to rest, then untied the rope from his waist and secured it around another large tree on this bank. Now there was a line stretched across the river, anchored on both sides, hanging just above the water's surface where the current pushed it. He made his way back across using the rope as a guide, and found the crossing slightly easier with something to hold on to. Eleanor had retrieved his pack and was guarding it along with her own small carpet bag when he emerged, dripping and breathing hard. "That looked terrifying," she said quietly. "It was not pleasant," he admitted, "but now we have a line to follow. That will make it easier for you." He took the shorter rope and approached her. "Turn around," he said, and when she did, he wrapped the rope around her waist, being careful to tie it securely but not so tight that it would hurt her. His large hands worked quickly, and he tried to ignore the way she smelled of lavender soap beneath the dust and sweat of travel. It had been a long time since he had been this close to a woman. "The water will be cold," he warned as he finished tying the rope that connected her to him. They were now linked together by about 6 feet of line. "Colder than anything you have likely felt. It will steal your breath and make your muscles seize up. You have to fight through that. Keep your eyes on me and keep moving forward no matter what." Eleanor nodded, her face pale but resolute. "I am ready." Yates led her to the water's edge and felt her hesitate as the first shallow waves lapped at her boots. "Stay right behind me," he said, and stepped into the current. The water soaked through her dress immediately, and he heard her sharp intake of breath as the cold hit her. But she did not stop moving. She followed him step by step as they waded deeper, and Yates felt a surge of respect for this woman who faced her fear head-on rather than retreating from it. When the water reached her waist, Eleanor stumbled slightly, and Yates immediately reached back to steady her. His hand closed around her arm and he felt how she trembled, though whether from cold or fear he could not tell. "I have you," he said firmly. "Just keep walking." They were in the deepest part now, where the current ran strongest. The water came up to Eleanor's chest and Yates could feel the force of it trying to push her downstream. He positioned himself slightly upstream from her, using his body as a barrier to break the worst of the current. His muscles screamed with the effort of keeping them both upright, but he gritted his teeth and pushed forward. Then a piece of debris, a broken tree branch carried by the flood, came rushing at them. Yates saw it at the last second and threw his arm up to deflect it, but the impact still threw Eleanor off balance. She went under with a cry that was cut off by the water, and Yates felt the rope between them snap taut as the current grabbed her. He planted his feet and pulled with all his strength, his powerful arms flexing as he hauled her back toward him. Her head broke the surface and she gasped, choking on river water, her eyes wide with panic. "Hold on to me," Yates shouted, and she threw her arms around his neck in a desperate grip. With Eleanor clinging to him, Yates could no longer use the rope stretched across the river for guidance. He had to rely on his own strength and sense of direction, fighting the current that now tried to sweep them both away. He took one step, then another, his boots slipping on the smooth rocks underfoot, but always finding purchase. Eleanor's weight on his chest made it harder to breathe, but he tightened his grip on her and kept moving. It felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes. Every muscle in Yates's body burned with exertion, and his lungs felt like they might burst. But then his foot struck something solid, and he realized they had reached a sandbar in the middle of the river. He half carried, half dragged Eleanor onto it, and they collapsed together in the shallow water, both gasping for breath. "We are halfway," he managed to say between breaths. "Just have to do that again." Eleanor's eyes were closed and water streamed from her hair and dress. "I cannot," she whispered. "I am sorry, I cannot do it again." Yates sat up, his hand going to her shoulder. "Yes, you can. You just did the hardest part. The other side is easier. The current is not as strong there. I promise you, I will get you across." She opened her eyes and looked at him, and he saw something shift in her expression. She was studying his face as if really seeing him for the first time, taking in the determination in his gray eyes, the strength in his jaw beneath the beard, the absolute certainty in his voice when he made that promise. Whatever she saw there seemed to give her courage, because she nodded and pushed herself upright. "All right," she said. "Let us finish this." The second half of the crossing was indeed easier, as Yates had promised. The current was still strong, but the channel was shallower on this side, and they kept their footing better. Eleanor no longer clung to him in panic but walked beside him, one hand gripping his arm, trusting him to guide her. When they finally stumbled onto the far bank and collapsed on dry ground, Yates felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made him dizzy. They lay there for several minutes, too exhausted to speak. The sun was warm on their faces, and gradually Yates became aware that his body was pressed against Eleanor's, their legs tangled together where they had fallen. He quickly rolled away and sat up, busying himself with untying the ropes. "You saved my life," Eleanor said softly, sitting up and wringing water from her hair. "If you had not come along, I would have tried to cross alone and surely drowned." "You would have died, yes," Yates agreed bluntly. He did not believe in false modesty. "That water does not forgive mistakes." "Then I owe you my life," she said, meeting his eyes. "I will not forget that, Yates Brennan." He felt something strange flutter in his chest at the way she said his name, but he pushed it aside. "We need to get moving. You are soaked through, and once the sun goes down, temperatures will drop. Need to find shelter and get a fire going." They retrieved their belongings from the other side by pulling them across on the rope, and then Yates untied both ends and coiled the wet hemp carefully before stowing it in his pack. Eleanor stood shivering in her wet dress, her arms wrapped around herself. Yates studied her for a moment, then made a decision. "You cannot travel in that. You will freeze when the temperature drops tonight. I have some spare clothes in my pack. They will be too big, but they are dry." Her eyes widened. "I cannot wear your clothes. That would not be proper." "Proper does not matter when you are dead from exposure," Yates said flatly. He pulled out a spare shirt and a pair of buckskin trousers. "These are clean. Put them on under your dress to keep warm, or wear them instead of your dress. Your choice. But you are not traveling in wet clothes." He turned his back to give her privacy and walked a short distance away, scanning the landscape for a good place to make camp. This section of the Rio Grande cut through high desert country, all red rocks and scrub brush and endless sky. To the west he could see mountains in the distance. To the east the land flattened out toward the plains. It was harsh country, unforgiving to those who did not know how to survive in it, but Yates had always found a strange beauty in its severity. "You can turn around now," Eleanor called after a few minutes, and when he did, he found her wearing his buckskin shirt over her dress. She had wrung out as much water as she could from the fabric, and the combination of his loose shirt and her dress looked odd but practical. "Thank you," she said. "This is much warmer." They began walking south, following a faint trail that paralleled the river. Yates set a steady pace, not too fast but not dawdling either. They needed to cover ground before nightfall, but he also did not want to exhaust Eleanor, who was clearly not accustomed to hard travel on foot. As they walked, she told him her story in bits and pieces. She had been living in Santa Fe for the past 3 years, working as a teacher in a small school. Her younger sister, Maria, had married a merchant who owned a general store in Hachita, and Maria's first child was due any day now. Eleanor had saved enough money for the stagecoach journey south, but when she had fallen ill with a fever in Espanola, the driver had refused to wait for her to recover, afraid she would infect the other passengers. "I do not blame him," Eleanor said as they navigated a rocky section of trail. "It is dangerous to travel with someone who is ill, but I had spent all my money on the ticket, and I had no way to send word to Maria. So when I recovered enough to walk, I simply started walking. I thought surely I would find another town, or another stagecoach or something. But there has been nothing but wilderness." "You are lucky you did not encounter Comanche," Yates said. "This is still their territory, even if the army pretends otherwise. They do not take kindly to lone travelers." Eleanor paled slightly. "I had not thought of that. I suppose I was too focused on reaching my sister to consider all the dangers." Love makes people foolish, Yates said, then added. But brave too, not many would have attempted what you did. They walked in silence for a while, and Yates found himself acutely aware of her presence beside him. He had spent so long alone that having another person so close felt strange, almost invasive. Yet there was something about Eleanor that did not irritate him the way most people did. She did not chatter needlessly or complain about the harsh conditions. She simply walked with determination, her eyes on the path ahead, her jaw set with that same steel he had seen earlier. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Yates spotted a cluster of rock formations that would provide good shelter. He led Eleanor to them and found a natural alcove formed by two massive boulders leaning against each other. It was protected from the wind and would hide the light of their fire from anyone traveling at night. "We will camp here," he said, shrugging off his pack. "I will build a fire. You should change out of that dress and hang it to dry." While Eleanor changed behind the rocks, Yates gathered wood and kindling. His practiced hands had a fire going within minutes, and soon the comforting crackle of burning wood filled their small shelter. He laid out his bedroll and offered it to Eleanor, but she shook her head. "I cannot take your bed," she protested. "You have already done so much for me." "You take it," Yates said in a tone that left no room for argument. "I have slept on bare ground more times than I can count. One more night will not hurt me." He busied himself with preparing a meal from his supplies, digging out some dried venison and hardtack. It was not fancy food, but it was nourishing. As they ate by the firelight, Eleanor asked him about his life as a trapper, and Yates found himself talking more than he had in months. He told her about the isolation of the high country, the silence that was so profound it seemed to have weight. He told her about tracking elk through deep snow, about outsmarting coyotes that tried to steal his catches, about nights spent in his cabin, watching the northern lights dance across the sky. He did not tell her why he had chosen this solitary life, and she seemed to sense that some topics were not open for discussion. In turn, Eleanor spoke of her work as a teacher, of the children she had instructed in reading and arithmetic. Her father had been a Mexican merchant who married an Irish immigrant woman, and Eleanor had grown up speaking both Spanish and English, moving between two cultures with ease. When her parents died in a cholera outbreak 5 years ago, she and Maria had been left with nothing. Teaching had been the only respectable work available to an unmarried woman of limited means. "Maria is my only family now," Eleanor said softly, staring into the fire. When she wrote to tell me she was expecting a child, I knew I had to be there for the birth. She is frightened, I think, though she tries not to show it in her letters. She is only 22, and so far from the home where we grew up. I need to be there to help her." Yates nodded, understanding that kind of devotion. He had left his own family behind when he came to the mountains, but that was different. That had been his choice, his decision to cut those ties. Eleanor was fighting to maintain her connection to the only person left who mattered to her. "We will get you there," he said. "Hachita is about 3 days' journey from here on foot. If we move at a good pace and do not encounter trouble, you will be with your sister by the end of the week, just as you planned." Relief flooded Eleanor's face. "Thank you. Truly, I do not know how I can ever repay you for your kindness." "Do not need repayment," Yates said gruffly, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Just doing what is right." As the fire burned down to embers, Eleanor curled up in the bedroll and was asleep within minutes, exhausted from the ordeal of the river crossing and the long walk afterward. Yates sat with his back against the rock, his rifle across his knees, keeping watch. He told himself he was just being cautious, that this was dangerous country and someone needed to stay alert. But the truth was, he was not ready to sleep yet. His eyes kept drifting to Eleanor's sleeping form, to the way the firelight played across her face, making her auburn hair glow like burnished copper. She was beautiful, there was no denying that, but it was more than her looks that drew his attention. There was a strength in her, a resilience that reminded him of the land itself, harsh and unforgiving on the surface but capable of surprising gentleness if you knew where to look. Yates shook his head, trying to clear these thoughts. He had no business thinking about Eleanor Ortiz beyond getting her safely to her destination. In 3 days they would reach Hachita, and she would disappear into her sister's life, and he would go back to his mountains and his solitude. That was how it had to be. He was not a man suited for connections, for the complications that came with caring about another person. Yet as he sat there in the darkness, listening to the soft sound of her breathing and watching the stars wheel overhead, Yates could not shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him during that river crossing. When he had pulled Eleanor from the water, when he had felt her arms around his neck and seen the trust in her eyes, something long dormant in his chest had stirred to life. And now, looking at her sleeping peacefully, because she knew he would keep her safe, he felt that unfamiliar feeling grow stronger. He forced himself to look away, to scan the darkness for threats, to do anything but think about the woman lying a few feet away from him. But it was no use. Eleanor Ortiz had already worked her way under his skin, and Yates suspected that getting her out again was going to be far more difficult than getting her across that river had been. When dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Yates woke Eleanor with a gentle touch on her shoulder. She startled awake, then relaxed when she saw him crouching beside her. "Time to move," he said quietly. "Want to cover as much ground as possible before the heat of the day." They ate a quick breakfast of more dried meat and some wild berries Yates had gathered the night before, then set out again. Eleanor's dress had dried overnight, and she changed back into it, returning Yates's shirt with thanks. They walked south through country that grew increasingly arid, the scrub brush giving way to cactus and yucca plants. The sun beat down mercilessly, and even in early May the heat was formidable. Yates showed Eleanor how to wrap a bandana around her neck and soak it with water from his canteen, letting the evaporation cool her skin. He pointed out which plants were edible and which were poisonous, which tracks in the dust belonged to harmless jackrabbits, and which belonged to rattlesnakes. Eleanor absorbed all of this information eagerly, asking intelligent questions that showed she was really listening, really learning. Around midday, they stopped to rest in the shade of a rock outcropping. Yates was rationing their water carefully, knowing they would need it to last until they reached the next reliable source. Eleanor noticed his careful measuring and looked worried. "Are we running low?" she asked. "We will be fine," Yates said. "There is a spring about 2 hours from here. We will refill there." But when they reached the spring, they found it had dried up, leaving only a muddy depression in the earth. Yates cursed under his breath, his jaw tightening. This was the danger of desert travel. Water sources that had been reliable for years could disappear without warning. "How far to the next one?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Yates calculated mentally. 10 miles, maybe 12. We will reach it by nightfall if we push hard. We have enough water to get us there, but we cannot waste any. They walked through the afternoon heat with grim determination. Yates took the lead, his sharp eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of water or danger. Eleanor followed without complaint, even though he could see the exhaustion in the way she held her shoulders, in the way she stumbled occasionally on the uneven ground. As the sun began to set, they crested a low rise, and Yates saw what he had been looking for, a line of cottonwood trees in the distance that marked the presence of water. He felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "There," he said, pointing. "We will have water soon." But as they drew closer, Yates spotted something that made him stop abruptly and put his arm out to halt Eleanor. There was smoke rising from the cottonwood grove, and he could make out the shapes of horses and wagons. Someone else had made camp at the spring. "Stay behind me," Yates said quietly, unslung his rifle from his shoulder. "Could be travelers, could be trouble. Let me handle this." They approached the camp cautiously, and as they got closer, Yates relaxed slightly. He could see that it was a small wagon train, probably settlers heading west. There were 3 wagons circled around the spring, and he counted maybe 10 or 12 people moving around the camp. A man saw them approaching and called out, and suddenly several rifles were pointed in their direction. Yates stopped and raised his free hand, keeping his rifle pointed at the ground in a non-threatening manner. "Just travelers looking for water," he called out. "Mean no harm." An older man with a gray beard stepped forward, his rifle still raised. "You can approach, slow." Yates and Eleanor walked into the camp, and Yates felt the suspicious stares of the settlers on them. He understood their caution. This was dangerous country, and trusting strangers could get you killed. But he also knew they looked like an odd pair, a buckskin-clad mountain man with a refined woman in a dusty traveling dress. "Name is Yates Brennan," he said calmly. "This is Eleanor Ortiz. We are heading to Hachita, just need to refill our water and we will be on our way." The older man lowered his rifle slightly. "I am Jacob Miller. These are my people, families heading to California to start new farms. You can take water, but then you move on. We cannot spare supplies for strangers." "Do not need supplies," Yates said. "Just water." A woman stepped forward, middle-aged with kind eyes. "Jacob, that poor girl looks ready to drop. At least let them rest for the evening. They can share our fire." Jacob Miller looked like he wanted to argue, but his wife's stern expression made him reconsider. "Fine, one night, but you keep to yourselves." Yates nodded his thanks and led Eleanor to a spot near the spring but away from the main camp. They filled their canteens and drank deeply, the cold spring water a blessing after the long hot day. Eleanor sat down heavily on the ground, and Yates could see that she was nearing the end of her endurance. "How are you holding up?" he asked, crouching beside her. "I am fine," she said, but her voice was strained. "Just tired." Yates studied her face and saw the blisters on her feet where her boots had rubbed, saw the sunburn on her nose and cheeks despite his efforts to keep her shaded. She had not complained once, but he could see the toll the journey was taking on her. "We will rest here tonight," he said. "Give you a chance to recover before we push on tomorrow." As darkness fell, the settler camp came alive with the sounds of children playing and women preparing supper. Yates built a small fire for himself and Eleanor, apart from the main group, and heated some of their dried meat. The woman who had spoken up earlier, Jacob Miller's wife, came over with a pot of stew and 2 bowls. "You both look half-starved," she said kindly. "This is not much, but it is hot and filling." "Thank you," Eleanor said warmly. "You are very kind." The woman, who introduced herself as Sarah Miller, lingered for a moment. "If you do not mind my asking, how did a lady like you end up traveling through the wilderness with a mountain man?" Eleanor explained about the stagecoach and her journey to reach her sister, and Sarah's expression softened even more. "You poor dear, that must have been terrifying. But you are in good hands with Mr. Brennan, I think. A man who can survive out here alone is a man who knows what he is doing." After Sarah left, Eleanor and Yates ate the stew in companionable silence. It was the first hot meal either of them had eaten in days, and it tasted like heaven. When they were finished, Eleanor insisted on cleaning the borrowed bowls at the spring and returning them to Sarah with thanks. Yates watched her walk back through the camp, saw how she paused to smile at a small child who waved at her, saw how her face lit up with genuine warmth. She had a gift for connecting with people, he realized, for making them feel at ease. It was the opposite of his own nature, which tended to make people nervous or wary. When Eleanor returned, she found Yates had laid out the bedroll for her again and was preparing to sleep on the bare ground. She sat down and looked at him seriously. "You have been taking care of me since we met," she said. "Always giving me your supplies, your bedroll, going without so I can have. I want you to know that I see what you are doing, and I am grateful." Yates felt uncomfortable under her direct gaze. "Anyone would do the same." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "They would not. Most men would have left me at that river, or would have demanded payment I could not give, or would have expected things in return that I could not offer. You have asked for nothing and given everything. That is not common, Yates Brennan, that is rare." He did not know what to say to that, so he just nodded and turned to tend to the fire. But he felt her words settle around his heart like a warm blanket, and he realized with something close to shock that he wanted her good opinion, wanted her to see him as worthy of her gratitude. That night, as the camp settled into sleep around them, Yates lay awake again, keeping watch. But this time, his thoughts were not on potential dangers lurking in the darkness. Instead, he was thinking about the woman sleeping peacefully nearby, about the way she smiled at children and thanked strangers for small kindnesses. He was thinking about how her hand had felt in his when he pulled her from the river, about the way her green eyes caught the firelight, about the sound of her voice saying his name. And for the first time in 5 years, Yates Brennan allowed himself to wonder what it might be like to have a life that included more than solitude and silence. He wondered what it might be like to have someone waiting for him when he came down from the mountains. Someone who smiled when they saw him, someone who made even the harsh wilderness feel a little less lonely. But he pushed these thoughts away as quickly as they came. Eleanor was going to her sister in Hachita. She had a life there waiting for her, a family that needed her. And he had his mountains and his traps and his chosen isolation. Their paths had crossed by chance, and soon they would diverge again. That was the way of things, and Yates knew better than to wish for alternatives. Yet, as he finally drifted off to sleep in the early hours before dawn, it was Eleanor's face that filled his dreams. And when he woke, he could not shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed inside him, something that could never be changed back. They left the settler camp at first light, after Yates traded some of his furs for additional dried food from Jacob Miller. The old man had warmed to them slightly overnight, perhaps seeing that they were genuinely just travelers in need and not a threat to his people. "Hachita is about a day and a half from here if you keep a steady pace," Jacob told them as they prepared to leave. "Stay south along the river until you reach the old Spanish mission ruins, then head west. You cannot miss the town from there." Yates thanked him for the information and the supplies, and then he and Eleanor set out once more. The morning was cool, a blessed relief after the previous day's heat, and they made good time across the desert landscape. As they walked, Eleanor seemed more relaxed, more comfortable with both the journey and with Yates himself. She asked him questions about his past, gentle inquiries that she did not push when he gave vague answers. In return, he found himself asking about her life as a teacher, about the children she had taught and the things that had brought her joy. There was a little boy named Thomas, Eleanor said, her face soft with memory. He was 7 years old and could barely read when he came to my school. His parents were poor, and they needed him to work on their farm, so he missed many days. But he was so eager to learn. He would stay after the other children left, practicing his letters until his fingers were cramped from holding the pencil. Did he learn? Yates asked, genuinely curious. Yes, Eleanor said with pride. By the end of the year, he was reading better than children twice his age. I gave him a book when the school year ended, a copy of Robinson Crusoe that I had bought with my own money. You should have seen his face. He looked at that book like it was made of gold. Yates found himself smiling at the image. You are a good teacher. I tried to be, Eleanor said. I always felt that education was the key to a better life, especially for children who started with so little. If I could give them the tools to read and write and think clearly, they would have a chance to make something of themselves. Is that what you will do in Hachita? Yates asked. Teach? Eleanor shook her head. I do not think so. Maria needs help with the baby, and her husband's store is quite busy. I expect I will help them there, at least for a while. Perhaps eventually I will start a school, if there are enough children in the town. But for now, my family comes first. They walked in silence for a while, and Yates found himself troubled by the idea of Eleanor giving up something she clearly loved. You should teach, he said abruptly. If that is what brings you joy, you should find a way to do it. Eleanor looked surprised. That is kind of you to say. It is not kind, it is practical, Yates said. Life is too short to abandon the things that matter to you. Trust me, I know. There was something in his tone that made Eleanor glance at him sharply. What did you abandon, Yates? He was silent for so long that she probably thought he would not answer. But then, perhaps because they were still a day away from Hachita and he would never see her again after they arrived, he found himself speaking. I was engaged once, he said quietly. 5 years ago, back in Missouri. Her name was Catherine, and her father owned the bank in our town. I worked for him as a clerk. It was respectable work, safe work. I wore a suit and kept ledgers and counted money all day long. Eleanor listened without interrupting, sensing that this was important. Catherine was beautiful and proper, and marrying her would have made me a man of standing in the community. But I was not happy. Every day felt like I was suffocating, trapped behind a desk doing meaningless work that any man could do. I wanted to be outside, to be free, to test myself against something real instead of just columns of numbers in a ledger. Yates paused, remembering those days with a mixture of regret and relief. One day I just could not do it anymore. I told Catherine I was leaving, that I was going west to become a trapper. She was furious. She said I was throwing away our future for a childish fantasy. Her father said I was weak, that I could not handle the responsibilities of being a man. But you left anyway, Eleanor said softly. I left anyway, Yates confirmed. And for 5 years I have lived in the mountains, alone with my thoughts and my traps. I have been cold and hungry and scared, but I have never once felt like I was suffocating. Every morning I wake up and I decide what to do with my day. No one tells me how to live, no one judges me for not fitting into their idea of what I should be. Do you regret it, Eleanor asked, leaving Catherine? Yates considered this carefully. I regret hurting her, she did not deserve that, but I do not regret leaving. I would have made her miserable if I had stayed, and I would have made myself miserable too. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is walk away. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then said, I think you were very brave. It takes courage to choose your own path, especially when everyone around you is telling you to choose something else. Or it was cowardice, Yates said, running away from responsibility and commitment. No, Eleanor said firmly. Cowardice would have been staying in a life that was killing your spirit just because it was easier than facing the unknown. What you did took strength. Her words settled over him like a benediction, and Yates felt something tight in his chest loosen. He had carried guilt about leaving Catherine for so long, had wondered if he truly was weak like her father had claimed. But hearing Eleanor's perspective, seeing his choice through her eyes, made him reconsider. Thank you, he said quietly, and meant it. They reached the ruins of the old Spanish mission as the sun was setting, a crumbling adobe structure that had been abandoned decades ago. The walls still stood, though the roof had long since collapsed, and it provided decent shelter from the wind. Yates decided they would camp here for the night rather than push on to Hachita in the darkness. As he built their fire inside the ruined mission walls, Eleanor explored the structure with curiosity. She found old religious carvings still visible in the adobe, and fragments of colored glass that had once been part of a window. Someone put so much work into this place, she said, running her fingers over a carved cross, and now it is just left to decay. Everything decays eventually, Yates said. That is just the nature of things. But for a time it mattered to the people who built it. That has to count for something. They ate their evening meal as the stars emerged overhead, visible through the open roof of the mission. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun went down, and Yates noticed Eleanor shivering despite sitting close to the fire. Without thinking, he shrugged off his buckskin jacket and draped it around her shoulders. She looked up at him in surprise. "You will be cold." "I have dealt with worse," he said, settling back down across the fire from her. "Besides, I run hot, always have." Eleanor pulled the jacket tighter around herself, and Yates tried not to notice how good she looked wearing something of his, how right it seemed. He had to stop thinking like this. Tomorrow they would reach Hachita, and this strange interlude in the wilderness would be over. "Yates," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice uncertain. "What will you do after we reach Hachita? Will you stay in town long?" "Just long enough to trade my furs and resupply," he said. "Then I will head back to the mountains. Summer is the best time for scouting new trap lines and repairing my cabin." "So you will be alone again?" "Yes." Eleanor looked down at her hands. "Does that not get lonely? Having no one to talk to, no one to share your life with?" Yates shrugged, though the gesture felt forced. "You get used to it. The solitude becomes comfortable after a while." "I do not think I could do it," Eleanor admitted. "I need people around me. Conversation and laughter and connection. The idea of being alone for months at a time sounds terrifying." "Different people need different things," Yates said. "There is no right or wrong way to live, just what works for each person." But even as he said it, Yates was not sure he believed it anymore. The past few days with Eleanor had reminded him of what he had been missing in his self-imposed isolation. The sound of another person's voice, the comfort of sharing a meal with someone, the simple pleasure of having another human being to care about and protect. He had told himself for years that he did not need these things, that they would only complicate his simple life. But now he wondered if he had been lying to himself all along. That night, as Eleanor slept wrapped in both his jacket and the bedroll, Yates found himself unable to settle. He paced the perimeter of the mission ruins, ostensibly keeping watch but really just trying to walk off the restless energy that filled him. His mind kept circling back to the same impossible question: what if he did not have to say goodbye tomorrow? But that was foolishness. Eleanor had her own life, her own obligations. Her sister needed her, and she had traveled all this way to provide that help. And even if she did not have those obligations, what could he offer her? A life of isolation in the mountains, scraping by on the money he made from furs, months of loneliness interrupted only by brief trips to trade. That was no life for a woman like Eleanor, who thrived on connection and community. Yet when he finally lay down near the fire and closed his eyes, his last thought before sleep claimed him was of Eleanor's smile, and he knew with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him that he was falling in love with her. The next morning dawned clear and bright, their last morning together. Yates was unusually quiet as they broke camp and set out on the final leg of their journey. Eleanor seemed to sense his mood and did not push him to talk, though he caught her glancing at him with concern several times. They walked west across scrubland that gradually gave way to signs of civilization. They passed a ranch house in the distance, then another, then a road that showed evidence of regular wagon traffic. By midday, Yates could see the buildings of Hachita in the distance, a small cluster of structures in the vast emptiness of the desert. As they drew closer, Eleanor's pace quickened, her eagerness to reach her sister overcoming her exhaustion. But Yates found his own steps slowing, reluctance weighing on him like a physical burden. Once they entered that town, their time together would be over. She would find her sister in her new life, and he would become just a memory, the mountain man who had helped her cross a river. They walked down the main street of Hachita, such as it was. The town consisted of perhaps 20 buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a small church, and various houses and outbuildings. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and their arrival drew curious stares from the few people who were outside in the midday heat. Eleanor was looking around eagerly, searching for something. Then her face lit up with joy and she grabbed Yates's arm. "There! That is Maria's store!" She pointed to a neat wooden building with a sign that read Ortiz General Goods, painted in careful letters. A woman who could only be Eleanor's sister was sweeping the porch, her pregnant belly obvious even from this distance. Eleanor broke into a run, calling, "Maria! Maria!" The woman on the porch looked up and her face transformed with shock and delight. "Eleanor! Eleanor!" She dropped the broom and hurried down the steps as fast as her condition would allow, and the two sisters met in the middle of the street in a fierce embrace, both talking and crying at once. Yates hung back, not wanting to intrude on their reunion. He watched as Maria pulled back to look at Eleanor, taking in her dusty dress and sunburned face with concern, and as Eleanor gestured back toward Yates, clearly explaining what had happened. Maria's eyes widened as she listened, then she turned to look at Yates with an expression of profound gratitude. Eleanor beckoned him forward, and he approached reluctantly, feeling awkward and out of place in this moment of family reunion. Up close, he could see that Maria was younger than Eleanor but had the same auburn hair and green eyes, though her face was rounder and her manner softer. "Mr. Brennan," Maria said, her voice thick with emotion, "my sister tells me you saved her life and brought her here safely. I cannot begin to thank you enough." "No thanks needed," Yates said gruffly. "Just happened to be in the right place at the right time." A man emerged from the store, dark-haired and friendly-faced, and Maria quickly introduced him as her husband, Antonio. He shook Yates's hand with genuine warmth and insisted that he come inside out of the sun. The interior of the store was cool and well organized, with shelves of goods ranging from dry goods to tools to bolts of fabric. Antonio led them through to the living quarters in the back, where he and Maria had made a comfortable home. Maria immediately set about making tea and fussing over Eleanor, demanding to know everything that had happened. Eleanor told the story of her journey, from being left behind in Española to meeting Yates at the river to their trek across the desert. Yates sat quietly, sipping the tea Maria had pressed into his hands and listening to Eleanor's version of events. She made him sound like a hero, emphasizing how he had risked his own life to get her across the river, how he had shared his supplies and his knowledge of the wilderness, how he had protected her from danger at every turn. "Mr. Brennan," Antonio said seriously when Eleanor finished her tale, "you have done our family an immeasurable service. Please, you must let us repay you in some way. Whatever you need, supplies, money, a place to stay, it is yours." "I do need supplies," Yates admitted. "Came to Hachita to trade my furs. If you have a fair price for them and the goods I need, that is payment enough." "We will give you the best price in New Mexico," Antonio promised. "And you will stay with us while you are in town. We have a spare room, and you are welcome to it for as long as you like." Yates wanted to refuse, to maintain the distance he knew he should keep, but the hopeful look on Eleanor's face made the refusal die on his lips. "Just for a night or two," he heard himself saying. "Then I need to head back north." The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Antonio helped Yates unload his furs and evaluate them for trade, offering prices that were indeed more than fair. Maria insisted on drawing a bath for Eleanor while Antonio did the same for Yates in a separate room, and the luxury of hot water and soap was almost overwhelming after weeks in the wilderness. When Yates emerged clean and shaved, having trimmed his beard back to something more civilized, he barely recognized himself in the small mirror Antonio provided. Without the thick beard and the dirt of travel, his face looked younger, more open. His gray eyes were clearer, and his dark hair, still long but now clean, fell past his shoulders in waves. He changed into clothes Antonio had loaned him, canvas trousers and a cotton shirt that were too small across the shoulders but serviceable. When he emerged into the main living area, he found Eleanor there, and they both stopped and stared at each other. Eleanor had changed into a clean dress that Maria had given her, a simple green cotton that matched her eyes. Her hair was clean and brushed, falling in soft waves around her shoulders, and someone had treated the sunburn on her face, so it no longer looked so angry. She was beautiful, more beautiful than Yates had realized during their journey when they had both been covered in dust and sweat and exhaustion. "You look different," Eleanor said softly, her eyes moving over his clean-shaven face. "So do you," Yates replied, his voice rougher than he intended. They stood there for a moment that stretched too long, until Maria bustled in with news that dinner was ready and broke the spell. The four of them sat down to a meal of chicken and vegetables and fresh bread, and it was the best food Yates had eaten in months. The conversation flowed easily, with Antonio and Maria asking questions about Yates's life as a trapper, and Eleanor contributing her own observations from their journey. After dinner, Maria's exhaustion became obvious, and Antonio insisted she rest. Eleanor went with her sister to help her get settled, and Antonio led Yates onto the back porch where they could smoke and talk in the cool evening air. "My wife is very grateful to you," Antonio said, lighting a cigar and offering one to Yates, which he declined. "She has been so worried about Eleanor, and to have her here safe and sound is a great relief, especially with the baby coming any day now." "Eleanor is a strong woman," Yates said. "She would have found a way to get here even without my help." Antonio smiled. "Perhaps, but we are glad she did not have to." He was quiet for a moment, studying Yates with shrewd eyes. "You have feelings for her." It was not a question. Yates tensed, his instinct to deny and deflect rising immediately. But Antonio's gaze was kind, not accusatory, and something made Yates tell the truth. Does not matter what I feel. I am not a man who can offer anything worth having. Why do you say that? Antonio asked. Because I live alone in the mountains most of the year, Yates said bluntly. I have no home except a one-room cabin that is buried in snow half the year. I make barely enough money to survive, and I have no prospects for anything better. Eleanor is educated, refined, used to civilization. She deserves someone who can give her a real life, not the hard existence I lead. Antonio puffed on his cigar thoughtfully. Have you asked Eleanor what she wants? Does not matter what she wants, Yates said. Matters what is right for her. With respect, Mr. Brennan, I think Eleanor is capable of deciding what is right for herself, Antonio said gently. But I understand your concerns. A man wants to be able to provide for the woman he loves. That is natural and honorable. He paused, then said, If you are interested, I could use a partner in my store. Business has grown beyond what I can manage alone, especially with the baby coming. I need someone strong and reliable, someone who knows the land and the people who live on it, someone who can handle the trading and the difficult customers. It would not be mountain living, but it would be honest work and good pay. Yates stared at him, stunned. You are offering me a job? I am offering you an opportunity, Antonio corrected. If you want it, think about it. You do not have to decide now. That night, lying in the spare room that Antonio and Maria had provided, Yates stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of the tumult in his head. Everything was happening too fast. 3 days ago, he had been a solitary mountain man heading to town to trade furs. Now he was clean and fed and sleeping in a real bed, and a man he had just met was offering him a complete change of life, and at the center of it all was Eleanor. Beautiful, strong, kind Eleanor, who had trusted him to get her across that river, who had walked through the desert without complaint, who looked at him like he was something more than just a rough trapper, who lived alone in the wilderness. Eleanor, who would be sleeping just 2 rooms away, close enough that he could walk to her door in seconds, but might as well be on the other side of the world for all that he could act on his feelings. Because the truth was, Yates was terrified. He had spent 5 years building a life that required nothing from anyone, that demanded no compromises or sacrifices. He had told himself he was happy with his solitude, that he needed no one. But Eleanor had shattered that comfortable lie in the space of 3 days, and now Yates had to face the truth he had been avoiding. He was lonely, desperately lonely, and he wanted more from life than endless silence and isolation. But wanting and having were 2 different things. Even if he took Antonio's offer, even if he stayed in Hachita and tried to build a new life here, what guarantee did he have that Eleanor felt the same way he did? She had been grateful for his help, yes, and she had been friendly and open with him during their journey. But gratitude and friendship were not love, and Yates had no idea if Eleanor saw him as anything more than the man who had helped her in her time of need. He must have finally slept, because he woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of voices in the main room. He dressed quickly in his borrowed clothes, and emerged to find Maria and Eleanor making breakfast while Antonio prepared to open the store for business. Good morning, Eleanor said with a warm smile that made Yates's heart skip. I hope you slept well. Better than I have in months, Yates admitted, real bed beats sleeping on the ground. They ate breakfast together, and then Antonio asked Yates to help him in the store for a few hours. Yates agreed, curious to see what the work might entail if he was seriously considering Antonio's offer. He spent the morning learning how the store operated, helping customers, moving heavy boxes of goods, and accompanying Antonio on a delivery to a nearby ranch. By midday, Yates had to admit that he could see himself doing this work. It was physical enough to keep him engaged, varied enough that it would not bore him, and Antonio was easy to work with, patient in his explanations and generous with his praise. More importantly, it was work that would allow him to stay in one place, to be part of a community, to have a real home instead of just a temporary shelter in the wilderness. In the afternoon, while Antonio took his turn helping in the store, Yates found Eleanor sitting on the back porch, mending one of Maria's dresses to fit her. She looked up as he approached and patted the chair beside her in invitation. Are you settling in well? She asked as he sat down. Antonio offered me a job, Yates said abruptly, the words bursting out before he could think better of them. Wants me to be his partner in the store. Eleanor's hands stilled on the fabric. And what did you say? Said I would think about it, Yates replied. It is a big decision. Would mean giving up trapping, giving up the mountains, starting a completely different life. Would you want that? Eleanor asked carefully. A different life? Yates looked at her, at the way the afternoon sun brought out the red in her hair, at the way her green eyes held his with an intensity that made his breath catch. I do not know, he said honestly. Part of me thinks I would be a fool to give up my freedom for a life of storekeeping. But another part of me thinks I have been a fool for years, choosing solitude when I could have had something more. Eleanor set down her mending and turned to face him fully. May I tell you what I think? Please. I think you are one of the bravest, strongest, most honorable men I have ever met, Eleanor said, her voice steady but soft. You rescued a stranger from certain death. You shared everything you had, even when it meant going without yourself. You protected me and guided me, and asked for nothing in return. You are good, Yates Brennan, in a way that has nothing to do with where you live or what work you do. She paused, her eyes searching his face. I also think you are lonely, even if you will not admit it. I think you have been running from connection for so long that you have forgotten what it feels like to let someone care about you, to care about someone else. And I think if you turn down Antonio's offer and go back to your mountains, you will regret it for the rest of your life. Yates felt his throat tighten. Why do you care what I do? In a few days I will be gone, and you will have your life here with your sister. What does it matter to you whether I trap or keep store? Eleanor reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm and small in his callous palm. It matters because I care about you, she said simply. These past few days together, they have meant something to me. You have meant something to me, and the thought of you disappearing back into the wilderness, of never seeing you again, it makes me sad in a way I was not prepared for. Yates's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. Eleanor, I am not the kind of man who is good at this, at feelings and words and knowing the right thing to say. But I need you to know that you have meant something to me too. More than something. You have made me question everything I thought I knew about what I wanted from life. Then stay, Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. Stay in Hachita. Take Antonio's offer. Give yourself a chance to have a different life, one that includes more than just solitude. And you? Yates asked, the question hanging between them. Would that different life include you? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. I would like that very much. Yates stood abruptly, pulling Eleanor up with him, and before he could second-guess himself or talk himself out of it, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss, not tentative or questioning. It was the kiss of a man who had been denying what he wanted for too long, pouring 5 years of loneliness and longing into the press of his lips against hers. Eleanor gasped against his mouth, then melted into him, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck. She kissed him back with equal fervor, and Yates felt something inside him break open. Some dam he had built around his heart cracking wide and spilling emotion he had not felt in years. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Yates rested his forehead against Eleanor's and tried to find words for what he was feeling. I do not know how to do this, he admitted. How to be with someone, how to build a life with another person. I have been alone for so long. Then we will learn together, Eleanor said, her hands cupping his bearded jaw. I have never been in love before either. This is new for both of us. Love, Yates repeated, testing the word. Then with more certainty, yes, I love you, Eleanor Ortiz. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you standing at that river, refusing to give up even when the situation seemed impossible. And I love you, Eleanor said, her eyes shining. You make me feel safe and challenged and valued all at once. I never thought I would find someone who could do that. They stood there on the back porch, wrapped in each other's arms, until the sound of Maria calling for Eleanor broke through their private moment. Eleanor pulled back reluctantly, her cheeks flushed and her lips swollen from kissing. I need to go help Maria, she said, but we will talk more tonight about what comes next. Yes, Yates agreed. We will talk. That evening, after dinner, Yates asked to speak with Antonio and Maria together. With Eleanor beside him, he explained that he was accepting Antonio's offer to become his partner in the store. He also, with a courage born of desperation, asked for permission to court Eleanor properly. Maria burst into tears of joy and hugged them both, while Antonio shook Yates's hand with a grip that spoke of approval and respect. I hoped this might happen, Antonio admitted. From the moment I saw how you looked at each other, I thought perhaps fate had brought you together for more than just a river crossing. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity and happiness. Yates moved his few possessions from his horse into the spare room at the store, though he spent most of his time working with Antonio to learn every aspect of the business. He proved to be a natural merchant, his honesty and straightforward manner earning the trust of customers who might have been skeptical of a newcomer. More importantly, he courted Eleanor with an intensity that made up for his lack of experience in such matters. He brought her wildflowers picked from the desert, sat with her on the porch in the evenings talking about everything and nothing, walked with her through the town as the sun set and painted the sky in brilliant colors. They talked about their pasts, their hopes, their fears. They learned each other's histories and dreams, and with each conversation the bond between them deepened. 3 weeks after Yates arrived in Hachita, Maria went into labor. It was a long and difficult birth that lasted through the night and into the next day, with Eleanor and a local midwife attending while Antonio paced and Yates tried to keep him calm. When the baby finally arrived, a healthy boy with a strong cry, Maria was exhausted but glowing with joy. "We will name him Yates," Antonio announced, looking at his new friend with gratitude. "After the man who brought my wife's sister home to us, and who has become like a brother to me." Yates was overwhelmed by the honor, and more than a little embarrassed by the attention. But when Eleanor took his hand and smiled at him, her eyes full of love and pride, he felt something settle in his chest. This was family. This was belonging. This was what he had been missing all those years in the mountains. 2 months later, on a warm July evening, Yates married Eleanor in the small church in Hachita. The whole town turned out for the wedding, curious about the mountain man who had given up his solitary life for love. Eleanor wore a dress that Maria had sewn for her, simple white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs, and she looked more beautiful than Yates had ever seen her. When the minister asked if he would take Eleanor to be his wife, Yates spoke his vow in a clear, strong voice that carried through the church. "I will." And when Eleanor spoke her own vow, her eyes never leaving his face, Yates felt tears prick his eyes for the first time in years. They made a home in a small house on the edge of town that Antonio helped them purchase, using the money Yates had saved from years of trapping combined with a loan from the store. It was modest but comfortable, with a bedroom, a sitting room, and a kitchen where Eleanor cooked meals that made Yates wonder how he had ever survived on dried meat and hardtack. The work at the store proved to be fulfilling in ways Yates had not anticipated. He liked dealing with customers, liked the puzzle of managing inventory and negotiating prices with suppliers. Antonio's trust in him grew, and within 6 months they had formally drawn up partnership papers that made Yates a half-owner in Ortiz General Goods. But the best part of his new life was coming home each evening to find Eleanor waiting for him. She had started a small school in their house, teaching the handful of children in Hachita their letters and numbers. Watching her work with the students, seeing the joy on her face when a child mastered a difficult concept, Yates felt proud that she had not had to give up her calling to be with him. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. They argued sometimes, learning how to navigate disagreements and compromises. Yates struggled with the feeling of being confined, missing the open wilderness and the solitude he had known for so long. Eleanor sometimes found his blunt manner difficult, wishing he would be more diplomatic in his dealings with difficult customers. But they worked through each problem with patience and love, and slowly they built a partnership that was stronger for having weathered those early storms. Yates learned to recognize when he needed space and would take long rides into the desert, returning refreshed and ready to engage with his life in town. Eleanor learned to appreciate his honesty and stopped trying to soften his edges, recognizing that his directness was part of what made him who he was. In the spring of 1877, Eleanor told Yates she was expecting a child. He was terrified and thrilled in equal measure, worried about being a good father but eager to meet this new person they had created together. When their son was born in December of that year, a healthy baby with Eleanor's auburn hair and Yates's gray eyes, they named him Samuel. Yates proved to be a devoted father, surprising even himself with how naturally the role came to him. He carried Samuel everywhere, talking to the baby in a soft voice that Eleanor had never heard him use before. He built a cradle with his own hands, carving careful designs into the wood, and sat up with Eleanor during the long nights when Samuel cried. "You are good at this," Eleanor told him one evening as she watched him rock their son to sleep. "Being a husband and father, I knew you would be, but I do not think you believed me when I said it." "I never thought I would have this," Yates admitted, his eyes on Samuel's sleeping face. "A family, a home, people who depend on me and who I depend on. I thought I was meant to be alone." "You were never meant to be alone," Eleanor said softly. "You just had not found the right person to be with yet." As the years passed, their family grew. A daughter, Rose, was born in 1879, with Eleanor's green eyes and a sunny disposition that charmed everyone she met. Another son, Henry, came in 1882, quieter than his siblings, but with a keen intelligence that showed itself early. The store prospered under Yates and Antonio's management, becoming one of the most successful businesses in southern New Mexico. They expanded the building, hired additional help, and Yates began making regular trips to larger towns to negotiate better prices with suppliers. He had a talent for business that no one, least of all himself had suspected, but success and prosperity did not change who Yates fundamentally was. He still woke early to watch the sunrise, still found peace in the vast emptiness of the desert, still valued honesty and directness above politeness and pretense. Eleanor never tried to change him, understanding that the rough edges were part of what made him strong, what had allowed him to survive alone in the wilderness, and what made him such an effective partner in both business and life. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised Eleanor by taking her back to the place where they had first met, the spot on the Rio Grande where he had found her staring at the rushing water. The river was lower now, easily fordable, but Eleanor still shivered as she looked at it. "I was so frightened that day," she said, holding Yates's hand. "I thought I might die out here, alone and far from everyone I loved. Instead, you found a new love," Yates said, pulling her close. "Changed both our lives that day. Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked, not for the first time.
Giving up your mountains and your freedom?
Yates looked at the river, remembering the man he had been 10 years ago. Solitary, closed off, convinced that isolation was strength and connection was weakness. That man seemed like a stranger now, someone he barely recognized. "No," he said firmly. "I have never regretted it, not for a single day. You gave me something I did not even know I was missing. You gave me a reason to be more than just a man surviving alone. You gave me a life worth living." They stood there by the river as the sun set, wrapped in each other's arms, and Yates thought about how much had changed because of a chance encounter and a swift river. He had crossed that water intending only to help a stranger, never imagining that he was crossing into an entirely new life. The rope he had used to guide Eleanor safely across was long gone, likely rotted away or repurposed years ago. But the connection it had represented, the thread that had bound them together in that moment of danger and trust, had only grown stronger with time. They had both been brave that day, Eleanor for trusting a stranger with her life, and Yates for opening his to the possibility of something more than solitude. As they walked back toward Hachita, toward their home and their children and their life together, Yates felt a contentment that went soul deep. He had spent 5 years in the mountains searching for something he could not name, and it turned out what he had been searching for all along was standing on the bank of a river, needing help to cross. He had secured a rope and led her across slowly, carefully, making sure she reached the other side safely. But in truth, Eleanor had done the same for him. She had thrown him a line when he was drowning in isolation, had guided him carefully back to the world of connection and love and family. They had saved each other that day by the river, and they continued to save each other every day since. In the years that followed, Yates and Eleanor's life in Hachita continued to flourish in ways that neither of them had quite anticipated. The store became a cornerstone of the small community, and Yates found himself taking on an unexpected role as a leader in the town. His reputation for honesty and fair dealing, combined with his willingness to help neighbors in need, earned him respect that transcended his rough origins. When Samuel turned 6, he began showing the same independent streak that had once driven his father into the mountains. The boy was fearless, always climbing things he should not climb and wandering farther from home than Eleanor liked. Yates recognized himself in his son and spent hours teaching Samuel how to read tracks, how to navigate by the stars, how to respect the wilderness without fearing it. "You are creating another mountain man," Eleanor teased one evening as she watched Yates show Samuel how to tie various knots. "I am teaching him to be capable," Yates corrected, "so he never feels helpless or trapped. But I am also teaching him the value of home, of family, of having people who matter to you." That was the lesson I had to learn the hard way. Rose, their daughter, inherited Eleanor's gift for connecting with people. By the time she was 7, she was helping her mother teach the younger children in the school, showing patience and creativity that delighted Eleanor. Watching his daughter work with the students, Yates felt a fierce pride mixed with a touch of sadness that his own parents would never know these grandchildren, would never see the life he had built. He had not spoken to his family since leaving Missouri 15 years ago. He did not even know if they were still alive, if they ever thought about him, or wondered what had become of the son who had walked away from everything they valued. Sometimes he thought about writing a letter, about trying to explain who he had become and why he had made the choices he did. But the words never came, and the distance in years felt too vast to bridge. It was Eleanor who finally pushed him to make the attempt. "You tell Samuel and Rose stories about your childhood," she pointed out one evening as they sat together after the children were asleep. "They know they have another grandmother and grandfather, somewhere in Missouri, aunts and uncles they have never met. Do you not think they deserve the chance to know that family? Do you not think your parents deserve to know they have grandchildren? Yates was silent for a long time, staring into the fire. "They were disappointed in me," he finally said. "My father told me I was weak, that I was running away from responsibility. I am not sure they would want to hear from me after all this time, or perhaps they have spent 15 years regretting harsh words spoken in anger," Eleanor suggested gently. "Perhaps they would welcome the chance to reconnect with their son, to know that you are alive and well and happy. You will never know unless you try." So Yates wrote a letter, laboring over every word with an intensity he usually reserved for important business negotiations. He told his parents about his life in Hachita, about the store, and his partnership with Antonio. He told them about Eleanor, about how she had changed everything for him, about the family they had built together. He told them about Samuel, Rose, and Henry, describing their personalities and accomplishments with a father's pride. And he apologized for leaving without trying to make them understand, for disappearing without a word for so many years, for any pain his choices had caused them. He did not apologize for the choices themselves, for becoming a trapper or leaving Catherine or rejecting the life they had wanted for him. But he apologized for his methods, for being too young and too stubborn to handle things better. He did not expect a response, so when a letter arrived 4 months later bearing a Missouri postmark, Yates stared at it for a full minute before he could bring himself to open it. Eleanor sat beside him, her hand on his knee, as he unfolded the pages with shaking fingers. His mother had written it, her familiar handwriting bringing back a flood of memories. She told him that both she and his father were alive and well, now in their 60s but still running the bank in their small Missouri town. She told him about his siblings, 2 brothers and a sister, all married now with children of their own. And she told him, in words that made Yates's throat tight, how much they had missed him, how many times they had wondered if he was safe, how glad they were to finally hear from him. His father had added a note at the bottom, just a few lines in his cramped handwriting. "I was wrong to call you weak. It takes more strength to choose your own path than to follow one laid out for you. I am proud of what you have built, and I would very much like to meet the woman who brought you back to civilization and the grandchildren I never thought I would have. Your father." Yates had to walk outside to compose himself, overcome by emotions he had not allowed himself to feel for 15 years. Eleanor followed him, wrapping her arms around him from behind as he stood looking out at the desert sunset. "They want to know us," he said, his voice rough. "Want to meet you and the children." "Then we should make that happen," Eleanor said. "Perhaps we could travel to Missouri next summer, when the children are out of school, and Antonio can manage the store without you for a while." And so, in the summer of 1888, Yates Brennan returned to Missouri for the first time in 16 years, bringing with him a wife and 3 children his parents had never met. The reunion was emotional and complicated, full of tears and laughter and awkward moments as people who had been strangers tried to become family again. Yates's father was older, grayer, but his handshake was still strong, and there were tears in his eyes as he looked at his son. "You have done well for yourself," he said simply, "better than I could have imagined." His mother could not stop touching him, patting his arm and his face as if reassuring herself that he was real. She was immediately enchanted by Eleanor, by her grace and intelligence and the obvious love between her and Yates. And the grandchildren won over both of Yates's parents within hours, with Samuel's fearless curiosity, Rose's sunny charm, and Henry's quiet intelligence. They spent 2 weeks in Missouri, repairing broken bonds and building new ones. Yates introduced Eleanor to his siblings and their families, showed his children the house where he had grown up, visited the bank where he had once worked and felt suffocated. That last visit was strange, looking at the building where he had once spent his days and barely recognizing the young man he had been. "I was miserable here," he told Eleanor as they stood outside the bank. "Could not breathe, could not think. All I wanted was to escape." "And now?" Eleanor asked. "Now I am grateful," Yates said. "Grateful I had the courage to leave, grateful I found you. Grateful for every choice that led me to the life I have now, but also grateful that I can come back here and not feel that suffocation anymore. I am not that trapped young man anymore. I am someone else entirely, someone who chose his own path and built a life he can be proud of." The trip to Missouri became a turning point for Yates, resolving old wounds and giving him a sense of peace he had not known he was missing. He and his father exchanged regular letters after that, building a relationship as adults that had not been possible when Yates was young. His mother sent packages for the children at Christmas and on their birthdays, and his siblings made plans to visit Hachita the following year. Back in New Mexico, life continued its steady rhythm. The children grew and changed, developing into their own people with their own dreams. Samuel, as Yates had suspected, inherited his father's love of the wilderness and began spending time with an old Apache tracker who lived on the outskirts of town, learning skills that Yates himself did not possess. Rose continued to work with Eleanor in the school and announced at 15 that she wanted to become a real teacher like her mother, perhaps even go to normal school to get proper training. Henry, the quietest of the three children, surprised everyone by showing a talent for mathematics and business. By the time he was 12, he was helping Yates with the store's bookkeeping and suggesting improvements to their inventory system that increased profits. Antonio joked that Henry would probably end up running the store someday, and Yates thought there was a good chance he was right. In 1890, Antonio and Maria's second child, a daughter named Carmen, married a rancher from a neighboring town, and Yates and Eleanor stood with them at the wedding. Looking at the young couple so full of hope and dreams, Yates was reminded of his own wedding 13 years earlier. "We were like that once," he said to Eleanor as they watched the bride and groom dance. "Young and uncertain and figuring everything out as we went." "We are still figuring things out," Eleanor pointed out with a smile. "We will probably be figuring things out until we are old and gray." "You might be old and gray," Yates teased. "I plan to stay young and vigorous forever." Eleanor laughed and pulled him onto the dance floor, and they moved together with the ease of long practice. Yates had learned to dance in the years since their marriage, though he still felt clumsy and awkward compared to Eleanor's natural grace. But she never minded his missteps, just smiled up at him with those green eyes that still made his heart skip after all these years. As the 1890s progressed, Hachita grew from a small outpost into a proper town. The arrival of the railroad brought new businesses and new residents, and Yates found himself serving on the town council, helping to make decisions about schools and roads and other civic improvements. It was a far cry from his solitary life in the mountains, but he discovered he had a knack for navigating the politics and competing interests that came with community leadership. Eleanor's school expanded as well, eventually moving out of their home and into a dedicated building that the town constructed. She hired 2 additional teachers to help with the growing number of students, but she remained the head of the school, beloved by students and parents alike for her patient teaching methods and genuine care for each child's success. Through it all, Yates and Eleanor's love for each other deepened and matured. The passionate intensity of their early relationship mellowed into something steadier but no less powerful. They were partners in every sense of the word, supporting each other's work and dreams, raising their children together, facing challenges as a united team. They still took walks in the evening when weather permitted, still sat together on the porch, talking after the children were asleep, still found ways to surprise and delight each other after years of marriage. Yates sometimes brought Eleanor flowers for no reason, and Eleanor sometimes made his favorite meals just to see him smile. They had learned each other's rhythms and moods so well that they could communicate with a look across a crowded room, could offer comfort without words when words were too difficult. In 1895, Samuel left home to join a geological survey team exploring the mountains of northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. He was 18 and eager for adventure, much as his father had been at that age. Yates understood his son's need to test himself against the wilderness, but Eleanor struggled with letting him go. What if something happens to him? She worried the night before Samuel was set to leave. He will be so far away in dangerous country. What if he gets hurt or lost? He is prepared, Yates assured her, though he shared her concerns. I taught him everything I know about survival in the wilderness, and he has good instincts, Eleanor. He will be careful. You could go with him, Eleanor suggested. The team would probably welcome an experienced guide. For a moment, Yates was tempted. The idea of returning to the mountains, of spending months exploring wild country with his son, called to something deep in his soul. But then he looked at Eleanor, at the worry and fear in her eyes, and he shook his head. My place is here, he said firmly. With you, with our daughters, with the store and the town council, and all the other responsibilities I have taken on. Samuel needs to make this journey on his own, needs to prove to himself that he can handle it. He does not need his father hovering over him. Samuel departed the next morning, and Yates and Eleanor stood watching until he disappeared from view. Eleanor cried quietly, and Yates held her, understanding her pain even though he believed Samuel would be fine. And Samuel was fine. He returned 8 months later, leaner and harder and full of stories about the places he had been and the things he had seen. He had found his calling in geology, in studying the bones of the earth and understanding how the landscape had been shaped over millions of years. He planned to attend college back east to study formally, though he promised to return to New Mexico eventually. Rose, meanwhile, had indeed gone to normal school in Santa Fe and returned with a teaching certificate. She began working alongside Eleanor in the school, bringing new ideas and methods that she had learned. Mother and daughter made an excellent team, and Yates often joked that between the two of them, they were going to educate every child in southern New Mexico. Henry, true to everyone's predictions, became increasingly involved in running the store. By the time he was 18, he was essentially managing day-to-day operations, freeing up Yates to focus on the larger business decisions and community leadership. Antonio began talking about retirement, saying he wanted to spend more time with Maria and their grandchildren before he got too old to enjoy them. In 1898, Yates turned 54 years old, an age he had never imagined reaching when he was a young man living hard in the mountains. Eleanor organized a surprise party for his birthday, inviting everyone they knew in Hachita and the surrounding ranches. Yates was overwhelmed by the turnout, by the affection and respect shown by friends and neighbors. "You have built something remarkable here," Antonio said to him during the party, the two men standing apart from the crowd and surveying the scene. "Not just the store, though that is certainly successful, but you have built a life that matters, a life that has touched many people. You should be proud." "I am," Yates admitted. "Though there are days I still cannot quite believe this is my life. Sometimes I feel like that solitary trapper is going to wake up in his mountain cabin and discover this has all been a dream. If it is a dream, then we are all dreaming it together," Antonio said with a smile. "And what a good dream it is." As the new century approached, bringing with it changes and uncertainties, Yates found himself reflecting more and more on the choices he had made and the path his life had taken. He thought about that day by the Rio Grande, about the terrified woman he had found staring at impossible water, about the decision to help her that had changed everything. If he had walked past Eleanor that day, if he had decided that helping her was not his problem, his life would have been completely different. He would have traded his furs in Hachita and returned to the mountains, continued living in isolation until age or accident or some other misfortune caught up with him. He would never have known the joy of marriage, of children, of being part of a community. He would never have discovered that he was capable of building something lasting, that he could be more than just a man surviving alone, but he had not walked past. He had stopped, had secured a rope, had led Eleanor across that swift river slowly and carefully, and in doing so he had crossed into a new life himself, one he had not known he was seeking, but that had turned out to be exactly what he needed. On the last day of 1899, as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Yates and Eleanor stood on the porch of their home, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. Their children were inside, preparing for a small party to mark the new year. Antonio and Maria and their family would arrive soon, and other friends from town had promised to stop by. 23 years, Eleanor said softly, leaning against Yates's solid warmth. 23 years since I stood by that river, terrified and alone, and you appeared like an answer to a prayer I had not known how to pray. 23 years since I was a lonely mountain man who thought he had life figured out, Yates replied, his arm around her shoulders. And you showed me I did not know anything at all about what truly matters. We were both lost, Eleanor said, in different ways, but lost nonetheless, and we found each other, and we found our way home. Yates kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair, still faintly lavender after all these years. You are my home, Eleanor, have been since that first day. The house, the town, the store, all of that could disappear tomorrow, and I would still be home as long as I had you. And our children, Eleanor added with a smile, and Antonio and Maria and little Yates, who is not so little anymore, and all the people whose lives we have touched and who have touched ours. We are not just each other's home, Yates. We are part of something larger, a web of connections and relationships that give meaning to our lives. Yes, Yates agreed, though it started with us. With a rope across a river and a leap of faith on both our parts. Inside, they heard laughter and the sound of music starting up. Rose was playing the piano that Yates and Eleanor had bought for her 16th birthday, and Henry was attempting to sing along, much to his siblings' amusement. Through the window they could see the warm light of the lamps, the faces of their children, the life they had created together. We should go inside, Eleanor said, though she made no move to leave Yates's embrace. In a minute, Yates said. Let me hold you a while longer out here under the stars. Let me remember this moment, this feeling of absolute contentment. Let me be grateful for every choice and every chance that brought us to this point. So they stood there together, wrapped in each other's arms as the old century died and a new one began. They had crossed many rivers together in the 23 years since that first meeting, some as swift and dangerous as the Rio Grande in springtime, others calmer but no less significant. They had navigated challenges and celebrated triumphs, raised children and built businesses, loved each other through good times and difficult ones. And through it all, they had held on to each other with the same trust and determination that had gotten them across that first river. Yates had secured the rope and led Eleanor across slowly, but she had trusted him completely, had put her life in his hands without hesitation. That trust had been the foundation of everything that came after, growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. When they finally went inside to join their children and greet their arriving guests, Yates felt more at peace than he ever had in all his 54 years. He was no longer the restless young man suffocating behind a bank desk, no longer the lonely trapper convinced that isolation was freedom. He was a husband, a father, a businessman, a community leader, a friend. He was all these things because Eleanor had needed his help crossing a river, and he had been brave enough to say yes. As the clock struck midnight and 1900 became reality, Yates raised a glass of cider with everyone else, toasting the new century and all it might bring. But his eyes were on Eleanor, as they so often were, and he saw her looking back at him with the same love and certainty that had been there from the beginning. "To us," he mouthed silently across the room, and she smiled and nodded, understanding completely. "To us, and to all the rivers they had crossed together, and to all the ones still to come." With Eleanor beside him, Yates knew he could ford any water, no matter how swift, no matter how cold. They had proven it that first day, and they had proven it every day since. And they would keep proving it for as long as they both drew breath. That was the promise they had made to each other without words on that riverbank 23 years ago. That was the vow they renewed every day simply by choosing each other, over and over again. That was the love story written in every rope thrown across dangerous water, in every hand extended to help someone reach solid ground, in every leap of faith that turns out to be not a leap at all, but simply the first step of a journey home. And as Yates Brennan stood in his warm house full of family and friends on the first day of the 20th century, he knew with absolute certainty that he was the luckiest man who had ever lived. Not because life had been easy, but because he had found someone worth living it with. Not because the path had been smooth, but because Eleanor had walked it beside him every step of the way. The river had been too swift to ford safely, that much was true. But Yates had secured a rope and led Eleanor across slowly, and in doing so, they had both crossed into lives richer and fuller than either could have imagined. And that, Yates thought as he pulled Eleanor close and kissed her to the cheers of their loved ones, that was everything that mattered.